Hello and welcome back to the Querying and Selecting Spatial Data module. In this portion, we are going to take a look at how we can combine both attribute and spatial queries using the tools in ArcPy. This will combine what we've learned about the attribute queries before and the spatial queries before, and we're going to combine them together and see how we can use them both in the same script. So for our example, for this section, we are going to look at the same two data sets, but with a slightly different scenario. We are going to look for how would you select all facilities that were health centers that are also within the county. So you can see here in the image from a desktop GIS software, the first image is simply selecting from this point data set of facilities all of those that are health centers, and then the second image is limiting that selected set then to those that fall within the county. So the first on the left-hand side is the result of an attribute query. The second is the result of a spatial query, but not just a spatial query on the entire facilities data set, a spatial query on the selected subset of the facilities from the first image on the left. So I also want to say that this logic of these selections could also be done the opposite way. You could first do the spatial selection and select for all of those facilities that fell within the county, and then select a subset of those using an attribute selection. So the key ideas that we're going to talk about when you combine these two types of queries works for both logic, either the attribute selection first and then the spatial selection, or the spatial selection first and then the attribute selection. What we're going to walk through here in our learning material is simply doing the attribute selection first and then the spatial selection. But know that if you had a scenario where you wanted to do those in the opposite direction, the same rules apply as what we're going to talk about through the script we're going to look at. Okay, so here is a very basic version of a script that what it would look like to accomplish this particular task. So you should notice by now that it's missing a lot of the elements that we typically have built around our scripts when we turn them in and write them to pass them off to someone else. So this should just be viewed as a very basic testing version of this script. So the workflow that we've chosen here is that we are going to start with our select by attributes. So you'll notice at the top all of your typical import of ArcPy, setting your workspace, setting overwrite output to make it so that our script can, number one, find our data, can pull in all of the ArcPy tools by importing the module, and now if we need to rerun this particular tool over and over again, the overwrite output will help us. So you'll notice down here first that we've chosen to do our select by attributes first. What that means is that we know that we then have to first make a feature layer, because we know that our select by attribute tool can only have an input of a layer, not an actual GIS data set. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a layer called facilities layer using the make feature layer management tool and store that in a variable that we're going to call facilities_lyr. Because we're doing an attribute selection, we also know that we need to have an SQL query to select out the attribute values that we want from our data set. So the best way to do that, as we've learned, is to set up that query and put it into a variable itself. So we're going to set up a variable called mySelection, and it's going to query out from our facility field all of those records that have the string health center. Now take special note again of the use of our quotation marks. Your entire SQL query has to be inside of a set of quotes. I've used single quotes for that. Because our field is a text field and all field attribute names are text, that name needs, the name of the field has to be within quotation marks as well. Convention of the profession is that we put those within double quotes. Our facility field is a text field, meaning anything inside of that field is also going to be a string or a text. So we know that what it's going to equate out to and what it's going to evaluate out to be is also going to be a string. So we have to have that around our surrounded with quotation marks as well. So that's where we'll see the convention of doing that escaped character with a single quote, and at the end of the string, another escape character and a single quote. That way, Python can go through and easily match up and find a pair for every single quotation mark as it works from left to right. All right, then we just get into our select layer by attributes tool, where we know that we need to have an input layer. We need to tell it what type of selection it's going to do. So we know this is a new selection. Out of all of our facilities, we want to select from our facilities layer everything that matches our SQL query, which we're putting in as my selection. So that's going to create a new selection in our facilities layer. So in your mind, you can imagine that as all of those points. Those ones that meet that criteria, that are health centers, would then be selected in blue if you were in a desktop software. A nice thing to do here often is just to print out the number of features that you've selected, just so you can start to see that you are actually, your SQL query was working and you were selecting out a selected set. Now, where this gets interesting now is that we're going to pair this with our select by location, our spatial query. So what we want to do is we want to select from that already selected set those that also fall within our county data set, that spatially overlay with our county data set. So we're going to take advantage of our select layer by location management tool, where our input is an in layer. So we're going to use our facilities layer, keeping in special mind that that facilities layer currently has a selection on it. So there are a set of selected features in that tool, in that layer right now. Now, the overlap type that we want with our county data set is within. We want all of our facilities that are within the polygon of our county. So that's our select features. Our select features is our county.shape. We don't have a search distance. We want only the things that are within that county. So we can use our double quotes here to escape through and to put a placeholder in for our search distance optional parameter. Sorry. And then we need to put in finally our selection type. Now this is where it gets really important that we have subset selection put here. Subset selection tells the tool that it's going to select from an already selected set. And that would be those that met our facility is equal to healthcare. So from that selected set, it's going to subset from there and select only from those items that fall within county.shape. Now remember, from these tools, if we were to have left off, if we were to just ended here and not done any of our optional parameters, the tool would default to be new selection. And remember, we learned that when we looked at the help documentation for our select layer by location tool. The default, if you do not put in a selection type, is to do a new selection. If we had done that, it would have unselected everything that we had done with our attribute selection and done a totally new selection on our full facilities layer, identifying all of them that fell within the county. So all of those points that fell within the county would then be selected, which means for our scenario here, we would have a gross overestimation of the number of healthcare facilities within our county, because we would have not been taking advantage of our SQL query of looking at just those health centers. So when you do these in stair step, when you do an attribute selection and then a spatial selection, you need to make sure that you use the subset selection, so you're selecting from the existing selection. If these were flipped, if we had done our spatial selection first and then our attribute selection, the same would apply. The first selection is a new selection. Any selections that come after that you want to be selecting from what you've done before need to remain subset selections. Again, here we're going to print out the number of facilities that we've identified, and then we're going to finally, best practices is to delete the variable where our layer file is living. So we can see here the result of this little script. It says the number of facilities that are health centers is 36. That's coming from this portion of our code right here after our select by attribute. We just did an ArcPy.getCount management on that layer, and then we did a print statement to tell us what that count was. We stored that number in a variable, and then we added it to a print statement. Then we went on and did our select layer by location, and you can see the printout there that the number of health centers within the county is 27, and that's being pulled from this last section of code where we did the same get count management on the same layer, but remember this layer now has a subset selection on it, so it's going to report out a smaller number than it did originally, and we've just told ourselves here that the number of health centers within the county is a total of 27. So that's just a really good example of some things you want to pay attention to when you're doing multiple selections within either desktop and also especially in ArcPy, because in the desktop you can start to visually see if what you're selecting doesn't match what you intuitively know should be coming out of your data. When you're scripting this, you don't get that visual feedback. So you need to put in these print statements to help you see what's going on, and you also need to be paying very close attention to your selection types when you're using selection tools. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about here is that there are some limitations of taking advantage of these attribute and spatial queries within ArcPy, specifically with our traditional GIS workflows that we're used to with the desktop software. So in the desktop software, if you wanted to update a set of records and update one of their attribute values from a selected set. Let's say we wanted to change health centers in the table to health care centers. So we would select for all of our facilities that were health centers, and then we would typically use the calculate fields on our table to calculate all of those selected records to then say health care centers. In ArcPy, the Calculate Fields tool is notorious for causing errors. It is not the best methodology for a coded program in Python to update values within a table. The proper way to do that in the world of coding and programming when you are working on a table or a database is to use what's called cursors. Cursors are available in ArcPy through the data access module, and that's actually going to be the next topic in this course. So right now we're learning about these selection queries, and in the next module we are going to learn about how do you update your data if you do have a selected set, and how do you identify those records that you want to update, and how do you physically get into the table and put your cursor into the table to update those records. So we're going to learn about those in the near future, but for right now we're just going to focus on our attribute and spatial selection tools, and that's what your next activity is going to be about.